On the night of August 18, 1983, three men left their hideout in Detroit, Michigan, and made their way into the industrial shadows of the city. By morning, 13 lives had been taken, all in a brutal clash over a single barrel of stolen whiskey. The Callahan brothers, Michael, Sean, and Patrick, had risen through the ranks of Detroit's criminal underworld, but their loyalty and ambition would soon test the very limits of the city's unspoken code. In the heart of the Motor City, a deadly war was ignited over what seemed like a small, insignificant theft, a barrel of whiskey that would set the stage for a bloodbath. This was a family bound by blood and hardened by years of struggle, but they had no idea how far their decisions would take them. What began as a simple heist for an easy profit quickly turned into a ruthless game of survival, with Detroit's criminal landscape forever altered. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. In Detroit, 1983, the city was at a crossroads. Once the epicenter of American industry, it was now a shell of its former self. The factories that had once employed tens of thousands were closing, leaving entire neighborhoods abandoned. Amidst this decline, the criminal underworld thrived. With the collapse of legitimate business, crime filled the void, fueled by a new generation of ambitious men who saw opportunity in the chaos. The Callahan brothers were among the rising stars of this dangerous new world. Michael, the eldest, was the brains of the operation. He had a calm and calculating demeanor, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Sean, the middle brother, had a fiery temper, quick to anger, and even quicker to act. Patrick, the youngest, was still carving out his place within the family business. Though less experienced, his ambition was unmatched. His eagerness to prove himself often drove him to make bold, risky moves. The Callahans weren't born into wealth or power. They had fought tooth and nail to carve out their territory in Detroit. Their journey into the criminal world started small, running liquor for some of the city's more established bootleggers and smuggling small shipments of stolen goods. But as they learned the game, they became more ambitious. They started making moves, carving out their piece of the city's underworld. The Callahans were known for taking risks others wouldn't dare. They were smart, ruthless, and relentless. Their big break came in the summer of 1983, when they became involved in the illicit whiskey trade that was booming across Detroit. The city's criminal factions were constantly vying for control of the whiskey business, a highly profitable market with huge underground demand. The Callahans had always been savvy with liquor, and over time, they built a reputation as some of the most reliable suppliers in the city. It was during this time that they crossed paths with the McDowell family, a powerful gang that controlled much of Detroit's whiskey distribution. The McDowells were veterans in the game, with decades of experience. They were tough, well-established, and had a tight grip on the market. But with the city's decline, they had begun to grow complacent. They no longer controlled everything as they once had. Their operations were sluggish, and their influence was starting to fade. The Callahans, on the other hand, were hungry for power. They saw an opening and made their move. It began with a simple offer. A barrel of whiskey had been stolen from a McDowell shipment, and the Callahans offered to buy it at a discount. To most, it was just a stolen shipment of alcohol. But to the Callahans, it was a chance to prove their worth in the criminal world. They promised a quick sale and big profits for both sides. The McDowells were hesitant, but the Callahans were persistent. They were shrewd businessmen, and they played the McDowells' greed against them. The deal was struck. For the Callahans, it seemed like a simple win. They had managed to get their hands on a valuable barrel of whiskey for a fraction of its worth. But for the McDowells, something didn't sit right. As the deal progressed, the McDowells began to suspect they had been double-crossed. They quickly realized the Callahans hadn't been honest. The barrel they had sold them wasn't theirs to sell. It had been stolen from a different shipment altogether. Worse still, the McDowells found out that the Callahans had been negotiating with multiple groups behind their backs. They felt betrayed, and their pride was wounded. The McDowells weren't the type to let betrayal slide. They had a reputation to uphold, and they weren't going to let the Callahans steal their business. So, they decided to retaliate. They started spreading rumors, telling anyone who would listen that the Callahans had stolen from them. The streets of Detroit quickly filled with whispers about the rising Callahan brothers and their supposed betrayal. Word traveled fast, and soon the Callahans found themselves at the center of a storm. Michael Callahan, ever the strategist, saw the writing on the wall. The McDowells weren't just angry, they were dangerous. Michael knew that if the situation wasn't handled quickly, things would escalate into something far worse than a simple street fight. So, he began making preparations. He gathered his brothers and told them to stay sharp. This wasn't just about whiskey anymore, it was about survival. The McDowells were coming for them, and they were coming hard. Meanwhile, the streets of Detroit buzzed with tension. Everyone in the underworld knew the Callahans were making a move. The McDowells were powerful, but they were also getting old. Their time was running out, and the Callahans were hungry for control. As the tension grew, the city's criminal factions began to take sides. Some were loyal to the McDowells, while others saw an opportunity in backing the Callahans. The brothers spent the next few weeks preparing for what was sure to come. Michael worked the phones, reaching out to anyone who could help them. Sean, eager for action, began gathering men for what was sure to be a brutal confrontation. Patrick, still trying to prove himself, found himself in over his head but was determined to show his worth. The tension between the brothers was palpable. On the night of August 18th, the situation boiled over. The McDowells, fed up with the Callahans' audacity, decided to send a message. It was a warm, muggy evening in Detroit, and the brothers were expecting trouble. They weren't disappointed. At 10 p.m., a group of McDowell men ambushed them outside one of their warehouses, guns drawn and eyes full of rage. A violent confrontation ensued. The Callahans fought back fiercely, but the McDowells were relentless. Shots rang out, echoing through the streets, and soon the world would know that Detroit's criminal underworld was about to change forever. The night was thick with tension, the air stifling, as the bullets flew through the darkened streets of Detroit. A series of gunshots shattered the quiet, the kind of noise that could only come from a full-on gang war. Michael Callahan had seen this coming for weeks, but nothing could prepare him for the brutality of the McDowells' retaliation. The brothers had always known that the world they operated in was a dangerous one, but it had always been calculated risks, shadows, and whispers. Now, it was real. Blood was being spilled, and there was no going back. Michael stood in the corner of the warehouse, trying to keep calm as the echoes of gunfire rang out outside. Sean, with his quick temper, was already charging forward, his own pistol drawn. The youngest brother, Patrick, was still unsteady. It was his first real taste of violence in the street, and the reality of it hit him hard. The once glamorous world of running liquor and doing deals now felt very different. This was about survival, not profit. The McDowells had come in full force. They were older men, seasoned in the criminal world, but they were just as dangerous as the Callahans. They had decades of experience, and they had been betrayed by the Callahans in a way they couldn't ignore. To them, it wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. It was an insult, a challenge to their authority. Michael knew that if they didn't respond with force, they would lose everything they had fought for. The Callahans weren't just fighting for whiskey anymore. They were fighting for their lives, for their place in the underworld, and for control of Detroit's criminal empire. As the McDowell men closed in on the warehouse, Michael gave the signal. "Get in position. Hold your ground," he whispered to his brothers. "We don't retreat. We fight." Sean was already out the door before Michael had finished speaking, charging into the chaos without hesitation. He had no fear of confrontation, and right now it was all about sending a message that the Callahans would not back down. The firefight intensified. The sound of gunfire filled the air as both sides exchanged shots. The McDowells had the advantage in terms of numbers, but the Callahans had the element of surprise on their side. They were smart, strategic, and deadly. They knew the streets of Detroit better than anyone. Patrick, still grappling with the weight of the situation, stayed close to Michael. His hands trembled, but he kept his cool. He wasn't ready for this. No one ever truly was. But there was no turning back now. He had to do whatever it took to survive, to prove himself to his brothers and to the city. In the heat of the battle, Michael spotted one of the McDowells in his line of sight. A man named Joey McDowell, an old rival who had been a thorn in their side for months. Joey was one of the McDowell sons, and Michael knew that if they could take him out, it would send a powerful message. Michael's eyes locked on Joey, and he took a deep breath. Time seemed to slow down as he aimed carefully, steadying his hand. He squeezed the trigger. A single shot rang out, striking Joey McDowell in the chest. Joey collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground, a symbol of the violence that had erupted between the two families. The McDowells, now reeling from the loss of one of their own, became more desperate. They launched themselves into a frenzied assault, hoping to overwhelm the Callahans with sheer force. But the Callahans, having planned for this moment, fought back fiercely. They knew the streets, the alleyways, and the buildings like the back of their hands. The battle raged on for hours, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The streets of Detroit became a war zone, with the McDowells and the Callahans locked in a deadly struggle for dominance. By the time the sun began to rise over the city, the fighting had subsided. The Callahans stood victorious, but at a great cost. Sean had been wounded in the leg, and Patrick was visibly shaken, his first taste of real combat taking a toll on him. Michael, however, remained focused, the calculated leader who had been in control since the beginning. Despite the victory, Michael knew that this was far from over. The McDowells would retaliate, and there was no telling how far they were willing to go to reclaim their position. But for now, the Callahans had won this round. They had sent a message, and the streets of Detroit would be talking about it for weeks. In the aftermath of the battle, the Callahans knew they needed to regroup. Michael quickly called a meeting, telling his brothers to stay vigilant and to prepare for whatever would come next. The fight for control of Detroit was far from over, and the Callahans weren't going to rest until they had claimed what was rightfully theirs. The city was changing, and the Callahans were no longer just players in the game. They were the game, and the McDowells, now licking their wounds, would have to decide if they were going to step back into the fight or accept their defeat. But as Michael looked at his brothers, he knew one thing for certain. They were ready. The Callahans had proven that they could handle anything that came their way, and Detroit would soon know that there was a new family in charge. Days passed, but the streets of Detroit had not yet forgotten the bloodshed. The McDowell family, though defeated, were not ones to back down. They seethed in silence, licking their wounds and plotting their next move. Michael Callahan could feel it in his bones. This was just the beginning of something far worse. The war between their families was not over. The Callahans had sent a message, but the McDowells wouldn't be the ones to roll over. In the aftermath of the battle, Michael made sure to keep a low profile. He knew that the chaos of the fight had drawn attention. Police, rival gangs, and even civilians had witnessed the violence. Detroit's criminal world was never one to shy away from conflict, but public attention was another matter. The city couldn't be caught in the crossfire forever. Still, Michael had to prepare for what was to come. The McDowells would not be deterred, and the Callahans would need to solidify their claim over the city. The brothers convened that night at their usual meeting spot, a dimly lit basement in an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and whiskey as they gathered around the table. The brothers had grown up together, and now they were standing at the precipice of something monumental. Their father had warned them about the dangers of ambition, but Michael had learned to ignore those warnings long ago. Power was the only thing that mattered now. "What's the next move, Michael?" Sean asked, his voice hoarse from the chaos of the previous days. His leg wound had been patched up, but he still limped with every step. Michael leaned back in his chair, looking at each of his brothers. Patrick, still shaken from the violence, stared at the table, his fingers tapping nervously against the wood. He had always been the one to ask questions, but now he seemed to be lost in thought, trying to make sense of the mess they had all found themselves in. "We need to control the city," Michael said firmly, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "The McDowells won't rest until they have their revenge, and we can't let them. We need to make sure the other families know that the Callahans are the ones in charge now. We can't afford any uncertainty. We have to be ruthless." "What about the cops?" Patrick finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "They're starting to ask questions. If the heat gets too much, We deal with that when it comes, Michael interrupted, his eyes locking with Patrick's. Right now, we're dealing with the McDowells and setting up our empire. We need to secure our territory and make sure no one dares to challenge us. Sean nodded, his hand resting on the edge of the table. We hit them where it hurts in their supply lines. Take out their distributors. Without the whiskey, they've got nothing. Michael's plan was already taking shape. The Callahans had already stolen a significant amount of the McDowells' product, but now they needed to cripple the McDowells' ability to distribute. With the city's criminal networks intertwined, every link in the supply chain was essential. If the Callahans could sever those ties, they could bring the McDowells to their knees. The brothers spent the next few days gathering intel. They worked with their trusted allies, leveraging old connections and striking deals with local informants. As the heat of the previous battle started to settle, they made moves to consolidate power. A few carefully executed raids on the McDowells' suppliers sent a clear message. The Callahans weren't afraid to do whatever it took to secure their hold over Detroit. But despite their victories, Michael knew the real battle had only just begun. He couldn't ignore the pressure building from the other families in the city either. The Callahans had made their mark, but the other power brokers of Detroit wouldn't sit idly by. Michael's ambition had drawn the attention of every major criminal family, and now it was a matter of time before someone made a move. Word started to spread, not just about the Callahans' rise to power, but about the bloody war between them and the McDowells. Detroit's underworld was buzzing, whispers of loyalty, alliances, and betrayals. Everyone had a stake in the game, and no one could afford to be passive. As Michael sat at his desk sorting through maps of the city, his mind raced. He had worked tirelessly to get where he was, but with every victory came a higher price. Power wasn't free. It came with enemies, with risks, and with the constant threat of retaliation. Still, Michael was determined. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let anything stand in his way. The McDowells, the cops, the rival families, they were all just obstacles in his path. He would remove them one by one, until Detroit was under the Callahans' control. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but Michael was willing to pay the price. His brothers, though still unsure of everything they were becoming, followed him without question. They had no choice. The Callahans were in too deep now. Detroit had never been a forgiving city, and the Callahans knew that better than anyone. In this world, only the strongest survived. The McDowells might have lost the battle, but the war was far from over. The streets would run red, and Michael Callahan was ready to claim his place as the king of them all. It was a cold, crisp morning in Detroit when Michael received word that the McDowells were regrouping. They hadn't vanished as expected. In fact, they had been quietly building up their forces, preparing for a counterattack. As much as Michael wanted to deny it, the war was far from over. It was escalating. And if the Callahans didn't act quickly, they might lose everything they had gained. Michael, now more determined than ever, gathered his brothers in the old warehouse. They sat around the same table where they had first plotted their rise to power, and the air was thick with tension. Sean's legs still hurt, but there was a fire in his eyes, the fire of someone who had seen what this fight could do. Patrick, on the other hand, was silent, staring out of the grimy window, watching the streets below as if they could offer him an answer. "We're not just fighting the McDowells anymore," Michael said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but filled with urgency. "The whole city is watching. We've made our move, but now we need to make it count." Sean leaned forward, his hands clenching into fists. "So what's next? We go after them again?" Michael nodded, but this time it would be different. "We don't just go after them. We send a message that no one can ignore. We wipe out their leaders completely." Patrick, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. "You're talking about making an example of them, showing the rest of the families that we're the ones who control this city." "Exactly," Michael said. "The McDowells need to know that crossing us comes with a price they can't afford to pay. But we can't do this the way we've been doing things. We need to be smarter. We need to go after their weaknesses, their key players, and we need to do it fast." The plan was set. Michael had already arranged for a network of informants to gather information on the McDowells' movements, weaknesses, and most importantly, their most vulnerable members. He knew that their operations were deeply rooted in the city's underground economy, and if the Callahans could attack the right people at the right time, the McDowells would have no choice but to retreat. The first strike came 2 nights later. Michael and his brothers led a small, coordinated team of loyal men to one of the McDowells' main distribution centers. It was an unassuming warehouse on the outskirts of Detroit, tucked between a block of abandoned buildings. The Callahans had learned that the McDowells were using this location to store their whiskey and run their illicit operations. With careful precision, they cut off all the exits. There would be no escape for the McDowells tonight. As Michael and his men moved through the warehouse, the tension was palpable. Each step echoed, reminding them of the risk they were taking. They had done this many times before, but this was different. This time, the Callahans weren't just making a move to take control. They were sending a message to the McDowells and to anyone else who thought they could challenge them. The operation was swift, calculated, and ruthless. Michael's men made quick work of the McDowells' guards, securing the warehouse and cutting off any means of communication. But as they searched through the building, they found something that made Michael's blood run cold. A map of Detroit, with areas marked in red and names written across them. It was a list of targets. The McDowells weren't just preparing to fight. They were targeting the Callahans, and they were going after Michael's brothers. "Shit," Michael muttered under his breath. The map was a warning. The McDowells had been planning this for months, and the Callahans had been unaware. Michael gathered his brothers, showing them the map. "This is bigger than we thought. They know where we live, where we work, where we move. We have to be ready." Sean's face hardened, the fire returning to his eyes. "We'll fight back, Michael. We'll hit them harder." The next day, the Callahans went on the offensive. They moved quickly, executing a series of hit-and-run tactics, hitting McDowell safe houses and their hidden whiskey storage locations. They also began taking out key McDowell figures, including suppliers and underworld brokers who were critical to the McDowell family's operation. But despite their efforts, the McDowells continued to fight back with equal intensity. The streets of Detroit were becoming a battleground. Every corner turned, every alleyway was another chance for someone to die. For Michael, this was more than just a fight for power. It was a fight for survival. He could see the toll it was taking on his brothers. Sean was growing more distant, his temper sharper with every passing day. Patrick, though outwardly calm, was starting to crack under the pressure. The weight of their actions, of the lives lost, was becoming too much for him to handle. But Michael couldn't afford to slow down. He couldn't show weakness, not now. The tension reached a boiling point when Michael received an anonymous tip that the McDowells were planning something big. The brothers gathered once again, this time with a sense of dread hanging in the air. "They're coming for us," Michael said quietly, his eyes scanning the faces of his brothers. "We either finish this now or we risk losing everything we've fought for." Sean stood up, his expression fierce. "Then let's finish it, Michael. Let's take them down before they get the chance." Michael nodded, and just like that, the war would enter its deadliest phase yet. The Callahans weren't just trying to take control of Detroit anymore. They were fighting for their lives. The night had fallen thick and heavy over Detroit, cloaking the city in a dark, oppressive silence. The streets that were once bustling with life now seemed eerily empty. Every passing car, every dim light from the street lamps felt like a potential threat. The Callahans had no choice but to move quickly, carefully. The McDowells were not going to back down, and Michael knew it. "Tonight," Michael said, his voice steady and calm, "we're going to make sure the McDowells know who's in charge. We hit them hard. We make them regret ever crossing us." Sean, who had been pacing in the corner, stopped and turned toward his brother. "Where do we strike first?" His eyes burned with a fire that hadn't been there before. Patrick, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. "We know they've been using the docks to move shipments in and out of the city. We cut them off at the source. We hit them where it hurts." Michael nodded. The docks. It made perfect sense. The McDowells had been smuggling whiskey, weapons, and all sorts of contraband through the Detroit River. By cutting off their access to these shipments, the Callahans could cripple their operations. Without wasting another moment, Michael gave the order. The Callahans set out to the docks with a precision that only years of planning and coordination could ensure. The streets of Detroit were cold and silent as they moved, shadows blending with the night. Their steps were calculated, deliberate. No one spoke, no one dared to make a sound. They had learned over the years that silence could be more powerful than words in this business. As they approached the docks, Michael's mind raced. This was the moment. The McDowells had underestimated the Callahans, thinking that they were just another family trying to muscle in on their territory. But Michael had other plans. He wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting for survival. When they reached the edge of the dock, Michael gave a signal. The men spread out, positioning themselves at key locations to control all potential exits. Every detail had been planned in advance. The timing, the weapons, the escape routes. It wasn't long before the first shots were fired. The McDowells had been ready. They knew that the Callahans would come for them. It was a trap, but it didn't matter. Michael and his brothers had the upper hand. The sounds of gunfire echoed across the water, and the night was shattered by the chaos that ensued. The McDowells were disorganized, scrambling to respond to the sudden assault. The Callahans, on the other hand, moved like a well-oiled machine. Their training, their unity, gave them the edge they needed. Michael fought with a cold efficiency, each pull of the trigger calculated, every movement swift and decisive. His mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. Not now. But as the battle raged on, Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were doing. He had always known that power came at a cost, but the cost was becoming clearer with every life they took, every enemy they eliminated. The McDowells fought viciously, but it wasn't enough. Within minutes, the Callahans had control of the dock. The McDowells' forces had been decimated, and those who weren't killed were captured or scattered. Michael stood in the center of the chaos, his breath heavy, his mind racing. They had won, but this was only the beginning. As the night wore on, the Callahans didn't waste time. They destroyed the McDowells' supply crates, setting fire to their shipments and sending a clear message to anyone who thought about crossing them. Michael's heart beat faster as the flames lit up the night sky. This was more than just a victory. It was a statement. "We've taken the first step," Michael said to his brothers, who were standing beside him, watching the destruction. Sean, covered in blood and grime, wiped his face and grinned. "And we're just getting started." But even as the flames rose, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The war with the McDowells had been brutal, but there was something bigger lurking in the shadows. Michael didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel it. There was a storm on the horizon, and it was coming for the Callahans. The victory at the docks had sent shockwaves through Detroit. The Callahans had sent a clear message to the McDowells and anyone else who dared to challenge them. They weren't to be underestimated. But as the weeks passed, Michael Callahan began to feel the weight of what they had done. The victory didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like the beginning of something much darker. Everywhere they went, people were watching. The city's underworld had always been a web of rumors and whispers, and now, more than ever, those whispers were about the Callahans. Michael knew that their rise to power hadn't gone unnoticed. The McDowells were just the first to fall, and soon other families would come for them, eager to take back what they thought was theirs. "Michael," Patrick said one night, his voice low, as the two of them stood on the balcony of their penthouse overlooking the city. "The McDowells weren't the only ones watching us. The other families are starting to take notice. They won't be far behind." Michael didn't answer right away. He stared out at the lights of Detroit, his mind racing. He had known this was coming, but knowing didn't make it any easier to prepare for. "I know," he finally replied, "but we can't stop now. Not after everything we've done. The McDowells were just the beginning. We take control of Detroit or we die trying." Patrick nodded, his jaw clenched. "We're prepared for that. But are you sure you're ready for the consequences? There's always a price to pay when you rise to the top." Michael turned to face his brother. I've been paying that price my whole life. And I'll keep paying it if I have to, but I'll make sure we come out on top. The brothers didn't speak much after that. There was nothing more to say. They knew what had to be done, and soon everyone else would too. As the weeks passed, the Callahans became more entrenched in Detroit's criminal underworld. They seized more territory, dismantled rival operations, and slowly but surely, they began to build an empire. But with every step they took, the stakes grew higher, and the threats grew more dangerous. The McDowells weren't gone for good. They were licking their wounds, regrouping, and making plans of their own. And the other families? They were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. Michael knew this was coming, but the pressure was starting to wear on him. One night, as they gathered in the safe house for a meeting, Sean broke the silence. We're being watched. There's no question about it. Michael looked up, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? I've been hearing rumors, Sean continued. The other families are starting to get restless. They want a piece of what we have, and they won't be satisfied until they get it. Michael's fists clenched. He had known this would happen, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. We can't let them take anything from us, Patrick said, his voice steady but filled with determination. Not after everything we've fought for. Michael nodded slowly. We take the fight to them before they have a chance to make a move. We strike first. We show them who's in control. In the days that followed, the Callahans began to prepare for the war they knew was coming. They had the power, the resources, and the drive. But there was one thing they didn't have: loyalty. The McDowells had been their first test, and now they were facing an even greater challenge, taking on the entire criminal network of Detroit. The families would no longer be scattered factions. They would become a single unified force, and the Callahans would have to fight them all at once. Michael had been preparing for this moment his whole life, but even he wasn't sure if they were ready for what was coming. Still, he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. He had made it this far, and there was no turning back. We'll hit them hard, Michael said, his voice sharp. We'll make them regret ever thinking they could take us down. And with that, the Callahans set their sights on the next target, the heart of Detroit's criminal empire. They would stop at nothing to seize control, no matter the cost. As the Callahans prepared for their next move, the tension in Detroit grew thicker. The city that had once felt like a jungle of opportunity now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. The Callahans had proven they were a force to be reckoned with, but now they would have to prove they could survive the storm they had unleashed. In the end, there was only one question that mattered. Who would be left standing when the dust finally settled? The night air in Detroit was thick with tension as Michael Callahan sat at the head of the table, the dim glow of a single light overhead casting long shadows across the room. The city felt different now. Colder, more dangerous. Everyone knew something was coming, and everyone was trying to position themselves before the storm hit. But Michael wasn't just worried about the other families. He was worried about what the power had done to them. It wasn't just the rivals they had to fight off now. It was themselves. Patrick, Sean, and the others sat in grim silence around the table, the weight of their recent victories weighing heavily on their shoulders. The tension in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the early days when they'd been just a few ambitious men looking to carve out a name for themselves. Now, they were a force to be reckoned with, but the price of that power was starting to show. Everyone's looking for a way in. Michael finally broke the silence. His voice was cold, detached as if he were stating a simple fact, but everyone in the room could hear the underlying frustration. We've taken down the McDowells, but it's only a matter of time before another family steps up. We can't keep playing defense forever. Sean leaned forward, his brow furrowed. We don't need to play defense. We need to take control. We need to make them fear us, make them understand that if they even think about crossing us, they'll regret it. Michael nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The McDowells were just the beginning. This is a war now, and we don't have the luxury of waiting. We have to strike before they do, but we have to be careful. Patrick slammed his fist on the table, his patience running thin. Careful? What the hell do you mean by careful? They've been gunning for us for months now. We've had to clean up after every one of their messes. I say we strike hard, take them down before they even have a chance to respond." Michael's gaze turned steely, his calm exterior hiding a storm of conflicting thoughts. "I agree. But we need a plan, Patrick. We can't just keep throwing punches and hoping we land one. If we make the wrong move, we could lose everything." A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone knew Michael was right, but the thought of waiting any longer felt like weakness. The city was alive with rumors. The Callahans were becoming a target, not just for the other families, but for the very streets that had once embraced them. They had made enemies, and in Detroit, enemies could turn into graves. Days passed, and the tension only mounted. Every step Michael took felt heavier than the last. The weight of the city's gaze, the ever-present feeling of eyes on him, was suffocating. But the Callahans weren't just anyone. They were survivors, fighters, and above all, they were family. Michael had been prepared to lose everything, but he was not prepared to lose his brothers. It was during one of these late-night meetings, as they sat in the shadows of their underground headquarters, that the first blow came. A sudden violent knock at the door. "Michael," the voice called out from the other side, "we've got a problem." It was Sean. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. Sean stepped inside, his breathing labored. "It's the McDowells. They're back. They've got allies, and they're coming for us right now." The room erupted into chaos as Michael sprang to his feet. The time had come. The game had changed. The McDowells weren't just licking their wounds. They were organizing a full-scale retaliation. And this time, it wasn't just about whiskey or power. It was about survival. Within hours, the Callahans had mobilized, preparing for the fight of their lives. They weren't just defending territory anymore. This was war, and war had no rules. As the family gathered in the dimly lit safe house, Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The city was on the brink of an all-out conflict. He had been ready for this, or so he thought. But there was something different about this fight. It wasn't just about territory. It wasn't just about money. It was about pride, about family, about proving to Detroit and to themselves that they would stop at nothing to protect what they had built. Patrick was already making calls, securing weapons and reinforcements. Sean was pacing, already thinking about their next move, but Michael stood still, lost in thought. "This is it," he muttered. "The storm is here." The others stopped, their eyes locking with his. "We're ready," Patrick said quietly. Michael nodded. "Then let's finish this." With the weight of the city's criminal underworld on their shoulders, the Callahans moved through the night, preparing for the showdown that would define their future. As dawn approached, the streets of Detroit seemed eerily quiet, but Michael knew better than to trust the silence. It was the calm before the storm. Dawn crept over Detroit in a pale, colorless light, the kind that did nothing to warm the bones or calm the nerves. The city felt suspended in time, a breath held too long. Michael Callahan stepped out of the safe house and into the brittle morning air, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the silent streets ahead. Today everything ended, one way or another. Patrick and Sean flanked him as the last of their men assembled. No one spoke. There were no speeches left to give, no promises left to make. The Callahans had crossed too many lines to go back now, and the McDowell alliance had pushed too far to be reasoned with. Detroit had become the battleground for a private war, and the ground beneath their feet felt thin, brittle, like the city itself was cracking open beneath them. "Where are they?" Patrick asked, voice low, steady. "Downtown," Sean replied. "Abandoned textile warehouse on Brush Street. They've set up everything there, shipments, manpower, their new partners. They're expecting us." Michael nodded once. "Good. We go in clean. We don't break formation. We don't panic. We end this fast." The brothers moved out, their steps synchronized, their minds locked into the same grim determination. They weren't armed to the teeth like most Detroit crews. The request had been clear: no weapons for this story. But the Callahans had grown up fighting with their bare hands long before they'd ever held their first gun. Brass knuckles, chains, steel rods, lengths of pipe, anything they could swing or strike with. Detroit wasn't kind to the unprepared, and the Callahans had no intention of dying unprepared. As they approached the warehouse district, the emptiness felt unnatural. No cars, no workers, not even the usual distant hum of early morning traffic. It was too still, too rehearsed. "They're watching," Michael murmured. "Let them," Sean said. "They'll know we didn't back down." The warehouse loomed ahead, massive, dark, and foreboding. Its windows were shattered, its metal siding covered in graffiti and rust. Yet inside, there were more than 24 men waiting, men who wanted the Callahans erased. Michael pushed the steel door open. It groaned loudly, echoing across the cavernous room. For a brief moment, only dust-filled beams of sunlight moved. Then figures emerged from the shadows. The McDowell remnants, battered but not broken, stood alongside two new crews, men from Chicago and St. Louis who had been promised territory, money, influence. Their faces bore no expression. They were here for business, not revenge. At the center stood Malcolm McDowell himself, bruised and scarred but still standing upright with a stubborn pride that seemed stitched into his bones. "Callahan," Malcolm spat, stepping forward. "You should have stayed in your lane." Michael didn't break eye contact. "And you should have stayed out of ours." Malcolm smirked, a cruel, tired smirk. "You think you run Detroit now? You think you can walk into my city and tear everything down? Detroit isn't yours. It never was." "Then today decides who it belongs to," Michael replied. No one said another word. The first punch came from one of Malcolm's men, a wide swing meant for Sean. Sean ducked, countered, and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. The fight exploded instantly. A wave of bodies collided in a storm of fists, metal pipes, and raw fury. The warehouse became a symphony of violence. Patrick tackled two men at once, slamming one into a support beam while the other swung a chain at his head. He caught the chain mid-swing and yanked its wielder forward, headbutting him so hard the man crumpled. Sean moved like a predator, quick, vicious, deliberate. Every strike was aimed to disable, every kick to break momentum. A Chicago enforcer charged him with a metal pole, but Sean sidestepped, grabbed the pole mid-swing and cracked it across the man's legs. Bone snapped. The man screamed. Michael was the eye of the storm. Focused, cold, calculating. He fought with the precision of someone who understood the stakes better than anyone. He swung a rusted pipe with brutal efficiency, dropping one man after another. But Malcolm was waiting, watching, studying his movements. Their eyes met. The fight around them blurred. "You took everything from me," Malcolm growled, stepping forward. "You started this," Michael replied. Malcolm lunged. The two men collided like two ends of a detonated charge. Malcolm fought with desperation, with rage, with the last fragments of a dying empire. Michael fought with something quieter but stronger. Purpose. They traded blows with the force of men who had nothing left to lose. Malcolm slammed Michael against a pillar, but Michael countered, driving his shoulder into Malcolm's chest. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground, rolling across concrete stained with decades of Detroit's forgotten wars. Malcolm managed to get on top, throwing punch after punch. Michael blocked, took hits, then caught Malcolm's arm and twisted it violently. Bones cracked. Malcolm screamed. Michael didn't hesitate. He struck once, twice, a third time. Malcolm's body went still. The warehouse fell silent. The remaining men, Chicago St. Louis, the last of the McDowells, looked around, breathless, bruised, and suddenly unsure. The symbols of their alliance lay broken on the concrete floor. Sean stepped forward, wiping blood from his face. "Anyone else?" One by one, the men backed away. They were fighters, not martyrs. And with Malcolm dead, there was nothing left to fight for. The Callahans stood in the center of the carnage, bruised, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. Patrick took a shaky breath. "It's over." Michael didn't answer immediately. He looked around the warehouse, the broken beams, the stained concrete, the silent bodies, and felt something heavy settle inside him. "It's never over," he finally said. "But this part is." They walked out into the morning light, Detroit awakening around them as if nothing had happened. They had survived, they had won, but the city would remember, and it would demand a price. Life continued, as it always does, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Almost. Revenge doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal wounds. It doesn't restore lost innocence. It only creates new dead, new wounds, new innocence destroyed. The Callahan brothers avenged their lost fortune but lost their peace. They eliminated 13 rivals but created 13 shattered families. They upheld a code of loyalty but violated their own humanity. They won a bloody battle for respect, but in the end, they lost the war against becoming exactly what they'd once fought against, the very thing they despised. The people they killed, they weren't just criminals. They were brothers, sons, fathers. In the end, only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. Was it worth it? If this story made you think about justice, revenge, and the price we pay for protecting those we love, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and morality, about how far we're willing to go when someone we love is taken from us. Comment below. What would you have done in the Callahan brothers' position? Where do you draw the line between justice and vengeance? Because these stories aren't just from the past. They're happening right now somewhere in Detroit, somewhere in America, with other people facing the same impossible choices in neighborhoods where the system has failed, and violence seems like the only language left. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One broken code, one violated respect, one desperate decision at a time.